is calling for a more expansive stimulus package plan, uh, worker bailout, people-centered plan, whatever you want to call it, to help out the average everyday person in the U.S. during this, public health and economic crisis that we're experiencing due to the coronavirus pandemic, and how it's just been hugely, obviously, detrimental to our economy. So he wants to make sure that workers remain employed and paid, providing social services for all, regardless of immigration status. That's awesome. Totally support that. It's also obviously really doubling down on Medicare for all, healthcare as a human right, healthcare free at the point of service. Duh, makes sense, saves money, $450 billion a year, and at least 68,000 lives. It's just obviously a no brainer. He talked about utilizing the Defense Production Act like immediately to actually get these companies in the private sector to produce this very much needed, personal protective equipment for healthcare workers and other frontline, workers who are just woefully underprepared or under resourced, I should say, when it comes to things like the N95 masks, the surgical gowns, the ventilators, the respirators, all of these things. And he also talked about providing food for everybody in the U.S. during this crisis, during this pandemic. Obviously, I'm in total support of that. Food, the basic necessities of life, like education, like healthcare, like housing, like food, like clean water, like, electricity, should all be considered public goods that are provided for the public. So we're not actually living in just some type of capitalist dystopia where, we have Jeff Bezos, who I believe it makes about, was it like $7,500 a second? And yet we have, 80 million people either underinsured or without insurance. We've had 10 million people lose their jobs in the last 2 weeks. How are those people going to be able to put food on the table? Totally support Bernie's point. Everybody, obviously, especially during a pandemic, everybody should have access to high quality, nutritious food. And I think that should be gone. It should extend beyond this pandemic. I think, obviously, like I said, that should be a right no matter if we're in a pandemic or not. He also talked about giving $600 billion in aid to cities and states to help address, any unmet needs they might be experiencing with regards to, things like, revenue shortfalls, or if they need to invest in certain things from a public health or economic standpoint. Makes sense. As well as an immediate suspension of rent, mortgage, medical debt, and consumer debt for 4 months. I think that's a little short-sighted. I think it should basically be for the duration of this crisis. I mean, like I said, we've had 10 million people, a record-setting number of people, lose their jobs, 6.6 million last week. And when we get the numbers for this week, next week, it's going to be even higher. How do we expect people to be able to pay their rent, pay their mortgage, pay this consumer debt, pay this medical debt during a pandemic when if you haven't been fired, if you haven't been laid off, if you haven't had your hours cut, then we are told to shelter in place. So obviously there's some incongruities there. How can people be expected to go to work to put their lives on the line if they're not in one of these, essential industries? Which kudos to everybody who is having to work right now, whether you are a healthcare worker in the food industry, if you're, a delivery driver for, UPS or Amazon or FedEx, or if you're a food delivery driver, if you're, part of the, if you're working sanitation, if you're picking up people's recycling, picking up people's trash, if you're, in the janitorial field, my heart honestly really goes out to everybody who is having to, put their lives on the line right now to making sure that we still are able to, have our food in our grocery stores. We're still able to get things, delivered to our house. We still have, doctors and nurses and people at the hospital to take care of us. So thank you to all those people. But for the people who aren't able to work right now, either due to, underlying health conditions, or they've lost their jobs, or they're not able to find a job right now because the economy's in the tank. Yes, we obviously need to suspend rent and mortgage payments. And Bernie, again, I think 4 months is too short. It should be for the duration of this crisis. I think our economy is frankly going to be in shambles for much longer than that, unfortunately. And then he also called for student loan payments, or student loan, debt to for people not have to pay their student loans, just having moratorium on having to pay student loans during the duration. Obviously support that. Student loan debt should have been one of the first things the federal government spent their money on, instead of bailing out Wall Street and these huge, massive corporations. It would have made a lot more sense to help out the 45 million or so people in the U.S. who have and are shackled with, I believe it's like 1.6 or 1.7 dollars, 1.6 or 1.7 trillion dollars, I should say, of student loan debt. And he didn't talk about it in this plan, but Bernie is also calling for everybody to get $2K a month for the duration of this crisis. Totally support that. Again, we need the emergency UBI like Bernie's calling for, the $2K a month, the the Medicare for all, obviously, especially during a pandemic. That's super important. Utilizing the Defense Production Act so we can get the PPE and these ventilators to the people that need it. Providing food, obviously important. The aid to the cities and states, and then the immediate suspension of rent, mortgage, medical debt, consumer debt for 4 months. Bernie says 4. I think it needs to be for the duration of the crisis. And ensuring that workers remain employed and paid, and providing social services for all regardless of immigration status. Boom. I mean, Bernie, gets it. He came out with this really good policy platform that's people-centered and not centered around the needs of these multi-billion-dollar corporations who are always trying to, suck on the teat of the government, if you will. But the critique that I have of Bernie, and some of the left have also made, people like Jimmy Dore think what you want of him, Kyle Kalinske of Secular Talk, is that Bernie and other leaders, other leftist leaders, both in the House and the Senate, totally dropped the ball on this previous stimulus package, because again, it was basically a 4.5 trillion with a T, bailout to these huge, massive corporations, while the people in the U.S. got basically crumbs, if that, with this one-time means-tested $1,200 check. Most people won't see for a couple weeks from now, and some, I heard, might not even get it for 5 fucking months during a pandemic. And then, they did have the expansion of the unemployment insurance, but I mean, it's, again, crumbs compared to what the corporations and Wall Street have gotten. And you really should have dug in at that point. Bernie, AOC, Ilhan Omar, Elizabeth Warren, Ro Khanna, etc., any so-called progressive or leftist really should have staked out a clear line in the sand then, and basically said, fuck off, this thing needs to be totally switched around. We need to first work on stimulus package for the people. That's what matters. We'll get this figured out. We'll make sure people have their needs met, because we're in a pandemic. We're going to be experiencing a Great Depression levels of unemployment and immiseration for the populace. These corporations, they can wait. We can deal with their bailout after that. So it's like, I mean, Bernie talks a good game, but he's not really willing to, use his platform to really speak truth to power, and to really throw a wrench into the gears of the political establishment. And I just think, unfortunately, he goes along to get along. more often than not, and isn't willing to criticize, the leadership in the Democratic Party. He isn't willing to call out Joe Biden's just total lack of any type of adequate response during this pandemic, and just the fact that, unlike Trump, Bernie's not willing to, burn the whole thing down to the ground in order to actually stand up for what's right. And it's a little bit disheartening that he's not, at that place where, he's like, if this shit doesn't get passed, I'm calling for a general strike. I'm calling for a rent strike. I'm calling for when, we're off of shelter in place, for people to get out in the streets and demand things like, Medicare for all, Green New Deal, free college, canceling student loan debt, rent and mortgage freeze, all of these things. He's not willing to take that next step. And I just think it's really unfortunate because, like for that last stimulus package, he could have easily blocked that bill and said, like, fuck off, I'm not doing this. This needs to be split up, or it needs to be a whole lot better than it was. I'm going to block this until Medicare for all is in there, until a rent and mortgage freeze in there, until an actual emergency UBI of $2,000 a month is in there, till, we cancel student loan debt. All of these things, Bernie and others in the Senate and the House could have really just, laid out a clear line in the sand. If this shit isn't in there, I'm not voting for it. I'm not supporting it. I'm not supporting this $4.5 trillion bailout of the same, billion-dollar corporations who are going to lay off workers, who are going to, engage in stock buybacks and enrich themselves while we're experiencing a pandemic. So it's like, I really like the things that Bernie's proposing, but unfortunately, I don't think he really understands, or maybe doesn't want to wield that type of power that is necessary right now to actually create the change that we need, because he needs to get more radical and extreme and say, if this shit doesn't get in there, then I'm calling on my supporters. I'm calling for people in the U.S. to go on a general strike. Don't show up for work. Don't show up for work. Don't help out. Stay home. And let's see what happens after a couple days. I bet the Congress and the Senate will come back and basically say, okay, yeah, we can do the 2K UBI a month. We can do the Medicare for all. Please help us get the economy restarted. It's like, you got to really be willing to put people's feet to the fire, if you will. And unfortunately, I just don't think Bernie is at that place. And I hope he gets there. And it's just like the thing some of his advisors, like Faiz Shakur, one of his, I believe his top campaign advisor, had wanted him to go after Joe Biden a lot more, and really call him out on all of his bullshit. But Bernie didn't want to, because he thought, and same with Jane Sanders, Bernie's wife, thought that, well, Joe Biden's a really nice guy. We don't really want to attack him. And, we didn't really like when Zephyr Teachout wrote that completely factual article in The Guardian calling out Joe Biden's corruption. We totally had to retract that and throw Zephyr Teachout on the bus. I mean, it's just Bernie Sanders doesn't really seem like he is willing to burn it down again, like Trump was, and that's a problem, from my opinion. So I mean, again, I really like and support the things that Bernie's proposing, but he needs to really be able to take a militant stance on this and say, like, if the people don't get what they need in this pandemic, in this time of huge just misery and suffering and death and unemployment and loss and depression, and all this stuff's going to get really bad because of this pandemic. If this stuff doesn't happen, then I'm going to tell people, go on a general strike, go on a rent strike, have everybody, stop paying their student loan debt, all of these things, in order to actually force some change from the outside force these politicians to actually start listening to the demands of the people in the US to what we need and what we want, and not be beholden to the corporate interests that tend to run our government and control our politicians. So again, I just wish Bernie Sanders was willing to take a more drastic stance on some of these things. So just my opinion. I would love to hear yours in the comment sections down below. Peace. Much love.